today we are going to be recording this, so hopefully they'll catch up on the proceedings of the day. And we have with us Ms. Sahi today. And Jane, as you can see, in Kannada the word Jane means honey. So we have in Jane Sahi a person who is as sweet as honey. In fact, in the book I was describing her before I met her, that the moment you see Jane, you just feel tranquil, right? Serene. Serenity descends on you. So that's the kind of person Jane is. And Jane has been engaged with innovations at the elementary school levels, and she is the founder of a school called Sita. And so because generally in various fields, among the various fields in education, the gap between theory and practice has always been so wide that it almost seems like two parallel tracks and the twine can never meet, as it were, right? So therefore, I think practitioners who have really worked, on the ground, their perceptions, their insights, or their experience has a very, very legitimate role to play in our learning here, as a university. And therefore, in that spirit, Jane Sahi is with us today to share her work with us. And even TIS Bombay, Tata Institute of Social Science, she's a very valued faculty there, and she's teaching a course there. And I think it should, as a tradition, we would like students to introduce teachers. So I have done one part of the introduction. Now I would like Kinnari, who is a student on this course, to say a few words about Jane, and then over to Jane just later.
I actually feel honored to introduce Jane and speak about her. I've grown up for the last 1 year as my teacher, and the topic that she is going to speak about, space for our own words. I think, as rightly said by Varmala, it's her class and it's her teaching that actually brings the theory and practice and understanding of language so much into play that it's been amazing to be a student. I'm privileged, and I welcome you, Jane, and thank you for coming here. We look forward to what you have to share with us.
So, we were going to start today with a lullaby from Wayanad, but unfortunately it doesn't work, so there's no chance of you going to sleep. But I've chosen this lullaby because it's from Wayanad, and the women in that area were toiling in the fields more or less as bonded labourers. And they used to hang their children, the babies, in hammocks on the edge of the paddy fields while they laboured. And so this song it's a very haunting song actually, which resounds so strongly. And it struck me that it was a kind of a dialogue of an attention, a kind of mutual attention, the meeting the child where the child needs. So that is one aspect of dialogue. The question I'm asking here, which sounds a very simple question, and before I began preparing for this talk, I didn't realize what a complicated question it was. But the question I want to think about is where do our words come from? When we sit down to write an essay, when we give a talk, when we are telling a story, where do our words come from? And the second question, which is related to that, is where do our words go? How do we share meanings? How do we make connections? Recently, I saw a film called Eternity and a Day. I don't know if any of you have seen this film. It's by a Greek director called Angelopoulos. I don't know if I've pronounced it correctly. But the story is about a poet who had been a very successful poet, but in his old age, he suddenly found that he was at a loss for words. And he withdrew almost into obscurity. His main companion was his dog. And he has no words. A man who is gifted with words, a man who has always been appreciated for his gift with words, is suddenly silenced. And one of the images in this quite complex film is how he has to buy words. It's almost as though he has to buy the words because he has to recover them. He has to recover words that have been worn out, words that no longer have meaning for him. So it's a very powerful image of, if we can imagine having to buy words to rediscover them. And in the course of his journey, he also at one point goes to a very terrifying zone, a sort of no man's land, very frightening sort of anarchy. And that also is very indicative of the kind of panic we might feel when we don't have words, when we have to start again, when we have not clear where boundaries are, a sort of no man's land. And but one of the things that he comes back to in the film are his memories of his childhood. And it's maybe in our childhood that we have the most uncomplicated responses to the world around us, not just to words, but to everything around us. So he is haunted by images of his childhood. So no doubt all of us at some time have had a sense of where words are somehow hollow or inadequate, especially times of joy or pain or sense of loss. These are the times when words seem to elude us, when we no longer have them, we can't use them in that easy way that we're used to. So I thought I would begin this presentation with just a few examples of children's work and of how they actually are able to express themselves in very different ways in their own words and in their own images. For the young child, there is a remarkable time of intensity when they first learn a language. It happens only probably once in our lives. It's like getting teeth or any of these. It's such an intense period where within just 2 or 3 years, a child develops by the age of 4 an active vocabulary of about 1,500 words and a passive vocabulary of about 1,000 words, plus the ability to use all kinds of complex grammatical structures, plus the ability to tell stories. Frank Smith, who wrote a book called Reading, remarked that thank goodness we don't try and teach children to talk in the way we teach them to read and write, because this process has its own momentum to make meaning. So, I was just saying that we all have our own illiteracies. I'm afraid we've jumped ahead. This is a painting by a child who was 4 years old. Not a painting actually, it's a drawing. And what was remarkable about it was that it was not just a drawing, it was not just a story. She actually enacted it as she was drawing, acting, making sounds, telling me the story. And the commentary was not even particularly to me. She was very involved in this process. It combined, as often fiction does, a mixture of real experience. Just before she had actually seen a shrew or a mugli in Hindi, Chuchunda? Yes? She had seen a dead shrew, but also she had been reading about a witch. So she wove these things together. The picture began with a round circle that she said was the witch's tummy. But the extraordinary thing was that she created a world beyond this picture as well. You may see, I think I can get up, on the far side, these blue sort of buttons. Those are shelves, and they open, they're drawers, they're magic drawers which can be opened. And she said about it, the shelves are deep and dark, but beyond them there's another room. And in that room there's a witch's friend is. He's always there. The shelves open by themselves very slowly, and the things reach there by night. At this point she stopped and enacted how the witch repeatedly bends and lifts sweets and dolls out of this basket. And then she announced, the witch has many friends, and that it will take one full year to see all his friends. So she has entered into this story in a very dramatic way. So I said, oh really? She said, but it's a secret. So I was left in the dark what it was about. But again, there was that kind of engagement with what she was doing. As children mature, they are often eager, if given support and space, to share a wide range of experiences, both positive and negative. Sometimes it's almost disarming the way children share about quite negative experiences in a day. Whatever I asked for, she gave. If I hit someone, then my mother said, don't do that, it will make a quarrel. When my mother was drinking, I said, don't drink, and then she was not drinking. After I joined the school, my father was bringing drink for her, and when they were quarrelling, I was feeling sad. My sister quarreled with my mother and took me away. Somebody came and told me that my mother had died and called us to come. I cried. I wish my mother was alive now. So these words are painfully poignant to read, but in a way, because the child has written almost exactly what he experienced, and yet he's created just enough distance to be able to communicate it. I think if it had been an older child, they might have tried to maybe elaborate on it. Or if it had been an adult, they would have tried to analyze and reflect about it. might even have shared their bitterness or their confusion. But here it's just as it is. And that's a good reminder somehow. I think one of the hallmarks of all good writing is economy and precision. And these are very apparent in this very short extract. In a very different mood. Sorry. Yes. Okay, so this is a very, very different kind of a mood, and it's an illustration of an extract from a story, a fragment of a story. Sister Owl sat upon a branch. Her voice was soft as she sang. 3 white feathers fell out of her breast. But somehow I think what's interesting about the image is that it conveys so much more than the words. And for children to have that balance of using image as well as word is so significant. But it's not only sharing about children's own experience, but actually being able to identify with other people's experience in their own words that's so important. Just want to read a last extract from a girl, an 11-year-old girl. The children were asked to write as though they were an object, an animal, or a particular person in the night. The following was written by a girl, and it was entitled, I am a watchman. I am a factory watchman. I stand like a dog at the gate and look at everything closely. What shall I say about myself? I'll tell you, and you listen. The whole night I have to wait. Nobody is with me. I'm like a ghost. If robbers should come, God only knows what would happen. If something gets lost, then it is my salary that it goes. In the night, men come for work. I only must write at what time they come and what time they go. Sometimes a lorry comes to bring things for the factory. I have to write and count what things come and how many there are. If I make a mistake because I am sleepy, God help me. This actually was written in Kannada. It's a translation. If I go to sleep and the owner comes, he scolds me and frightens me. He says, do I give you a salary for nothing? I'll deduct something from your salary, and if you do that again, you'll lose your job. I feel sleepy, so what can I do? How much can I sleep in the daytime? If I sleep in the daytime, my wife scolds me and tells me to do some work. In the night, the owner scolds me. This is my work. If I don't have this work, how can I look after my wife and children? I'm fed up with this work. I want to leave, but what can I do? Nobody should have to live like this. I've told you about my work. Now you also go and be a watchman, and then you will know whether what I am saying is true. I don't want to fall asleep, but I fall asleep and snore. At this time, if someone comes without making a noise, they will go inside. Sometimes I write the names of people who didn't come for work, and that person will get more money. But in the office they scold me. Sometimes people come late, but if I don't write that they came late at the correct time, they will scold me because they will get less salary. The office tells me that I will lose my job, but I beg them to let me stay. Don't do that to me, Swami. I have to look after my family. Sometimes I'm lucky. When I'm sleeping, nobody comes and there will be no disturbance in my sleep. This is my story. I don't think probably there's anyone in this room who could have written this. I certainly couldn't have begun to write in this way. I don't know quite where this child, her father is not a watchman, but certainly she must have heard some discussion about the life of a watchman, for it to be so vivid and such a kind of intimate kind of way of writing. But when we say our words, our own words, very often things are not written just alone. We also write together and we also collaborate. And that's something I've done quite a lot with children, is actually ask them to collaborate over writing a story. So the very last extract I'll read is a story of a group of 6 to 9-year-olds who wrote this story. They wrote it actually on their own. There was one moment when there was a squabble because somebody said, I want to start the story. But then somebody said, well, maybe you can end the story. So they said that. But beyond that, there was no adult intervention. Again, this is a translation from Kannada. Ajay and Roshan lived in one village. Roshan was sitting on top of a tree. Ajay ran. He was so tired he sat under a tree. Roshan was on that tree. He plucked some apples and dropped them down. They fell on Ajay. He ate some of the apples and put some in a bag. Ajay began to run. Ajay was going home on the path. He went the wrong way and went to the forest. A hungry lion came. The lion chased Ajay. More animals came. Then all the animals made a circle. Ajay's father and mother went to the police. They told the police that a boy called Ajay was lost. The police asked for Ajay all over the village. Next, the police went to look in the forest. Ajay had gone to that forest. He stayed in one house. There in that house there lived a lion, a squirrel, a dog, a cat, a mouse and a deer. Ajay was frightened and ran away. The lion ran after him to give biscuits and coffee. The police found them and then they all went to Ajay's house. I think we can see a rich, I don't know if you could see where different people had added things. They were different perspectives coming in, but there was also a single thread of narrative. It is this impetus to make meaning that is the driving force, not only for the newborn child, in the growing child, but in our lives as mature adults. We struggle to make meaning in innumerable ways. The examples that I have given are more kind of personal experiences and expression of feelings. But gradually the child learns to also use other kinds of voices, so that meaning and form take on different purposes, whether in writing a poem, or describing an experiment, or maybe explaining a theory. I think the other quality of writing, whether it's the youngest child or the oldest adult, is a kind of engagement in what they're writing. But to come back to this point of collaboration, we are born into a culture, and most likely a multicultural context. We can no longer really talk about a culture, a single culture. And that culture is also evolving. Your life here in the university is moving into another culture. And each culture is a moving, shifting pattern of kind of a framework of references, kind of assumptions also, on what is being called root metaphors. Root metaphors, as an example, many scientists work strictly within a kind of mechanistic way of viewing the world. That would be a root metaphor. Another one would be a notion of progress. That also is a kind of foundational idea which many of us are not even conscious, that actually conditions the way we look at the world, conditions the way that we interact with people, and the way we tell stories, the way we exchange and use objects. So all of these things come from a hidden, quite often hidden, cultural patterns and frameworks which we are part of. And sometimes this framework includes a view of silence, what we can be silent about. Some of you may have read, there was a very interesting research done in America about the Western Apache tribe. This is a Native American group in America. And for many years researchers had gone there, and they'd been quite scandalized because it looked as though these people didn't show feelings. When somebody died, when a stranger came, when somebody left, when somebody came back after a long time, there was silence. There was no visible expression. And so, you know, some researchers, we're talking about the 50s, which isn't that long ago, the 50s, people thought these people were almost less than human. You know, they weren't capable of emotion. And it wasn't until the 60s where more sensitive researchers and more aware researchers went in, that they began to notice exactly when it was that people were silent. And they found that it was at these critical, transitional times of conflict, times of death, times of birth, times of reunion, times of quarrels, when there was a kind of ambiguity and unpredictability about it. And so rather than intrude into that person's space, they actually consciously, deliberately stood back to, in a sensitive way, to let that person work things through instead of demanding a response. I guess all of us have had this experience. When you're too upset, you know, what's the matter? What's the matter? You know, tell us what's the problem. And you don't have words. And anyway, you don't feel like telling at that moment. So those kind of spaces are very culturally determined. I think in the West, which is a very verbal sort of culture, people often think that words, you have to say what you're feeling. If you quarrel, you have to say what's the matter. And actually sometimes it's space that is required, and silence, and respect, and trust that these things will be worked out in another way that's not verbal. But we don't require language in a vacuum. And there have been various terrible kind of experiments dating back from the Egyptians of trying to isolate children to see what their language was, whether language was innate or whether it was learned. So, for example, in the 13th century, Frederick II set up an experiment with human guinea pigs and isolated 2 children. Heaven knows what happened to those children, but if he was expecting to find out what the divine language was, he didn't. Because obviously no child can learn a language without interaction. just want to read something that the American anthropologist linguist writes, Sahi. Human beings do not live in the objective world alone, nor alone in the world of social activity as ordinarily understood, but are very much at the mercy of the particular language which has become the medium of expression for their society. It is quite an illusion to imagine that one adjusts to reality essentially without the use of language, and that language is merely an incidental means of solving specific problems of communication or reflection. No two languages are ever sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. No two languages actually construct the world in the same way. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same worlds with different labels attached. We often think, I think there is a kind of, on your cell phone, you can get a program where you can get an equivalent word, or you can somehow type in and get translations. And they're always grossly off the mark, or not always, but often, unless you're asking for something absolutely specific. So it's not that there are equivalents in languages. This might sound fatalistic, that we are in a sense determined by the language and the languages that we grow up in. And it is true that these play a very significant part. But it's not the only thing that builds up our language. The way we learn language has been described as a kind of apprenticeship. Usually we think of apprenticeship when we're trying to master a skill or a craft. But apprenticeship in learning a language means you're participating fully in a culture. And you're seeing it used for real purposes. So there's a kind of creative tension between the individual and the culture that surrounds. The other reason why this is not fatalistic is that culture is not something static. It is always evolving. It's not that we're just having to play out something that's in a culture. It's never still. And so we also are capable of contributing and shaping. We are shaped by a culture, but we also, to some extent, can potentially shape the culture itself. But this notion, I think what troubled me most in this discussion was the idea of our own words. Our own words seems to assume that there's a kind of personal autonomy here. And that idea has been more and more questioned. Is it true that we are in a position to make our own moral judgments? That we can make our own decisions in our life? Are we able to step back? So far, people have often thought that through a process of rational inquiry, that this was possible. But I think that has been fast left behind, because rationality takes us some way, but not very far. And rationality is only one way of trying to look at things and understand things. So even somebody like John Dewey, who was an advocate of a process of rational inquiry, saw it as a collaborative process. Still, he strongly emphasized that it was the rational process that was all important. And in recent times, people have looked at personal autonomy from a view of authenticity, not just personal, isolated, my individual view of things. And I wanted to tell a story which I feel is a good way of thinking about this question. It's a story called The Loathly Lady. Excuse me, can I have some water? The Loathly Lady is, could be called the hideous hag, the ugliest of women. The story tells of a king who was traveling one day in the forest, and suddenly he encountered a fierce knight who challenged him to a fight, and he couldn't refuse. But it seemed to him, as he stood before this knight, that the knight loomed larger and stronger, and his own strength seemed to ebb away until he felt drained and feeble. It wasn't very long before the king was at the mercy of the knight, and he thought his last moment had come. But the knight said to him, I will give you 7 days, and in 7 days you must come back, and if you can't answer my question, then you will lose your life. And the question is, what is it that women most desire? I'm sure we all have lots of answers. And so as King Arthur, as the king journeyed through his kingdom with the support of his loyal followers, he was given many answers. Richness, beauty, wealth, love. But none of them seemed the right answer. And all too quickly, 7 days had passed, and he was obliged to honor his promise to go back to face his death if necessary. And on the journey back, through the densest part of the forest, he suddenly heard a very soft and sweet voice. And he turned round, and he found that the owner of this voice was the most hideous, most grotesque woman that nature could have made. She was distorted in every way. Her skin hung in leathery layers of blubber. She had a single eye, and she was so revolting that he could hardly bear to look at her. And yet, this woman seemed to know what his quest was, what his urgency was. And she bade him come closer to her, and she said, I will whisper to you what it is that women most desire. I don't know if any of you know this story, but she whispered so softly that not even the trees could hear. And she said, sovereignty. Sovereignty means autonomy. And yes, he was sure that this was the right answer. And so, before he left her, he, as a king, he said, what reward can I give you? And to his horror, he was appalled when she said, I want one of your knights to marry me of his own free will. The poor king gasped. He was already married, and how could he ask his loyal followers to do this? Anyway, he journeyed on to the fiendish knight. His life was saved, and he returned to the court, and he shared his dilemma with his knights. And for a moment, there was a taut silence. And then one of the knights rose up and said, I will go, I will marry, I will honor this lady. And he happened to be the king's nephew and one of the bravest knights of the court. And so they set back off into the forest. And despite the murmurs and the jeers and even the sympathy, Gawain, for Gawain was the knight's name, played no heed. He married the woman with all courtesy and honor. And in the night, you maybe can imagine his feelings, he sat down with his head in his hands, not daring to look at this dreadful, dreadful person. And after some time, he looked up, and she was transformed into a beautiful woman. This isn't the end of the story. She said to him, "You have broken the spell by marrying me of your own free will. But this is only half the spell. And now you have to choose. I can be fair by day and foul by night, or I can be foul by night and fair by day." I hope I got it right. So, first, Gawain said, "Be fair at night so that I may enjoy your loveliness." But he saw pain cross her face. And he said, "No, you be fair in the court, and I will love you in any form." But still the pain was on her face. And so at last he said, "You choose. You choose whether you will be fair by night or fair by day, or fair by whichever." And as he said this, she laughed. And she said, "Now the spell is broken completely because you have given me the choice." This story has been used by the feminists a lot. But I want to actually just look briefly at it from Sir Gawain's perspective, because I think this gives us a very different take on autonomy. It is Gawain that actually volunteers to marry the lady, risking everything that he might have desired and trusting beyond what he could see. It is Gawain who elects to act with courtesy and compassion towards the woman. It is also Gawain who enables the other to be transformed to her true form. And the end of the story, which I didn't mention, which is a mysterious ending, that they lived in great happiness for 7 years, and then she disappeared. And so Gawain also had to face an almost unbearable tragedy when the love of his life disappears, and elect to choose how he will face that. So this is a very different view of autonomy from naked mindedness, the kind of view which is individualism. And it's individualism that's been such a disaster in our modern situation, whether in relationships or in our relationships, personal relationships, relationships with people we work with, people who work for us, invisible people who work for us, with nature. That is something quite different from this kind of autonomy. Because autonomy is not actually, it's not about self-centeredness. It's actually a way about decentering, a way of becoming aware of the other. And that's something very different. So, I don't know if any of you had a reaction when you saw the title of what I was going to say, Our Own Words. Maybe some of you thought, this is going to be it from a very Western perspective. You know, we can do our own thing. We should write from our feelings. And in the course of writing this, thinking about this talk today, I realized that that isn't what I actually wanted to say. It's another view of autonomy which is so important even in the way we encourage children to write, even in the way we write ourselves. Words, we've talked about words that are determined by our culture. We've also mentioned words that come somehow from our own particular experience. But there's also a way that words seem to have a life of their own, beyond our conscious control. There's a term which I like very much. It's the point of utterance. So what we think we're going to say, we might say it quite differently. What we thought when in the act of writing, in the act of speaking, comes out in quite a different way. And that is a very, that is what makes a language alive. It's when we actually, to some extent, lose control, lose rational control of ordering what we're going to say, what we're going to think. But again, there may be some skeptics who are quite nervous about this idea of language as a living thing. These are overworn metaphors sometimes. So I just want to spend a few minutes looking more closely, what do we mean by living language? And here I've referred actually to a British philosopher called Susan Langer, who's written a very interesting essay called Living Forms. So what does she say? She says that first of all, language is always in a state of flux. It moves, it changes, it's dynamic. And its very basic pattern is change. Secondly, she says, language has a unity and an organic structure. There's an interrelatedness. It's interdependent. And thirdly, another comment she makes is that language grows, but it also decays. We speak of dead languages and stale words and lifeless images. So language grows, but it also dies and becomes empty. Dialogue is these three elements: dynamic, relationship, and growth, and sometimes decay and dissolution. These are all aspects actually of dialogue. Dialogue is essentially an engagement with the other. A person, a text, a material. It's a different way of talking about the world that demands that we shift from what we know. It also takes for granted that there's a kind of uncertainty, that we have to renegotiate meanings. There's a freshness in the way we work and play with words. There's a term which is being used more and more about ecology of language. And that's not only about diversity of languages. Languages meaning the way that languages are dying out, the preciousness of languages in the same way that we talk about biodiversity. That's one aspect of it. But another aspect is that we tend to be dominated by certain ways of using language, especially in academic circles. We privilege only one kind of acceptable way of giving in an essay. I was just talking with Shailja. I mean, she was saying that you could, for example, ask students to write a poem or make a cartoon, or there are innumerable ways of not only words, and not only words used in a particular style. I'm not negating the importance of that, but I'm just saying, if we're talking about ecology, we're talking about a balance. so that these other ways of looking at the world, not so objectively, not so mechanistically, not so thinking we can be rational about things, is also very important. What makes it so difficult for us to use our own words? And it is indeed, it is difficult. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes we do go through an experience of, like a poet, a loss of words. When we are not sure anymore what we thought we knew, when something challenges us. And that's where dialogue comes in, that it actually is a dynamic space that we can move into. It's not that we can stay where we are with the words we've got, the ideas we have framed, our ways of thinking that we have inherited. We can't stay there. Shirley Bryce Heath, who some of you may know, she suggested that teachers should actually become what she calls cultural ethnographers. Means that we should understand the culture from which our students, our teachers, from each other, our colleagues, where they are coming from. And this is not from a vertical, patronizing vantage point. Because the fact is that we all are imbalanced in some way. If you had come to this college and when you arrived here you were asked to dance, you might have felt extremely uncomfortable. Or if you were asked to sing or act, any of these other ways of interacting or even to share personally, you might have felt quite uncomfortable to move out of a familiar mode of discussion. So, I'm sure you know the story of Tagore's parrot. The parrot, the parrot died of indigestion. Too many words of the wrong kind. And so, again, a kind of image of a living language. Piaget put it in terms of assimilation and accommodation, but actually we could almost say digestion. It's the way that we can make words our own. I think there's just a little bit more and then so much of school and indeed in college of what we learn is actually simply repeating what others have said. It's not so often that either the teacher gives a space for himself or herself or for the students to actually say, well, actually, I don't know. Actually, we have to think about this again. This is uncertain. This is negotiable. But usually we associate school with rote learning and repetition. And again, it would be a mistake to think that this is just a modern fashion to talk about our own words. I don't know when this was written, but Mukherjee, who writes about ancient education, quoted this. The person who is able only to recite the Vedas, but does not understand its meaning, is like a wooden post or a mere load bearer. But he who understands its meaning will attain to all good here and hereafter, being purged of sins by knowledge. For the word that is simply memorized and not understood will merely sound when uttered and not enlighten. Just as wood, be it ever so dry, will not blaze if it is put into what is not fire. I love that image at the end. That it's like wood not being in a fire. That it's dead. and not that what is a fire is alive, but it's transformed. So, we have begun to look at where words come from. And what's maybe the unanswered question is, where do our words go? And it is hopefully not what Freire suspects that academia is about. He says, he describes academic learning as a banking strategy of receiving, filing, and depositing. It's as though someone takes something and puts it in a treasure in a locker and brings it out for an occasional display of personal wealth. It's as trivial as that. So, critical thinking is often put forward as an ideal in itself. But critical thinking has often been used in quite negative ways. For example, in the world of advertising, or the distortion of news, or in propaganda that promotes hatred and war. So it's not just critical thinking. People are so clever at using strategies to kind of and understand how people work and how they think. I think advertising began in such a strong way with Freud's nephew, I forget his name, who actually advised as a psychologist how to play on people's fears and desires. So, it's not just critical thinking. In the film mentioned earlier, there is a kind of resolution, because the poet is not trapped in his own experience, and he becomes increasingly aware of people and the systems around him. He confronts violence and anarchy, not only in the society but also in himself. So it is here that we see he responds actually with compassion and engagement. It's kind of thought, word, action or engagement come together in a very whole way. Well, we were going to start with a lullaby. We didn't do that, but I'm going to conclude with something which I hope will wake us up. It's a poem by a Kannada Bhakti poet called Basavana from the 12th century. If you should speak, your words should be like pearls strung upon a thread. If you should speak, your words should be like the light of a ruby red. If you should speak, your words should be like a straight crystal spear. If you should speak, the linga should approve and say, yes, yes, my dear. But if your actions should betray your words, could the Lord of the meeting rivers care?
For reminding us how deeply cultural the act of teaching is, and how important it is to connect culture. For when you spoke about language, I was also translating it into the word culture, and I couldn't go problem at all making that shift. And certainly, how much of an act of cultural violence it is to expect students to force themselves to learn what I am interested in, but they are not. And that is a tremendous reminder of how much violence that is embedded in our ordinary classrooms, in our ordinary universities, and ordinary schools. It is very wonderful that you have reminded us. I want to thank you.
Really happy.
Looking forward to incorporating art as a part of the curriculum. Share with us a little bit about that.
art is a absolutely crucial element, and art in the broadest sense, that it's one very important way that actually we express our feelings, that we communicate to somebody. And it's not equivalent in words. It's each of these, whether it's music or art or image making or drama, these are all quite unique media. And often in school, word is privileged so that it's not included. So in the school where I work, we try to integrate art in many of the subjects, whether it's math or language learning or social studies or science actually. Because sometimes art is relegated to a kind of hobby, extracurricular activity. But I think it has to be right in the center somewhere of the whole of the curriculum, as one important dimension of learning. And again, it's not everybody's way, but nor are words everybody's way. And I think it's important, as Aman just said, in our school we take for granted that every child is going to paint. And once we had a child, he said he wasn't going to paint. He didn't want to paint and he didn't want to draw. He came when he was about 9, 10, he was very self-conscious. And so, it's one way that has to be an option, more than an option. It's a very viable kind of way of understanding and learning about the world and about ourselves. I mean, there's that first picture that I showed of how the child kind of drew, become sort of splintered. I think Rabindranath Tagore was a very rare person who actually was an artist, a writer, a poet, actor, musician, a singer. Very few of us cross those kind of boundaries. The most we can hope for probably is one area that's not just words in a kind of discursive way.
I was yesterday in our master's course here. Conduct your classes in the way you define participation. In a classroom, everyone is supposed to talk. And she said that I cannot talk. And so I'm feeling very uncomfortable.
Yes.
So it reminds me of what you're saying, and we don't know how to organize things in a way so that such students do not feel inferior. So it's a real issue for us.
And that was certainly to demand that somebody shares their deepest thoughts and their worst memories is not sensitive. It's not. People share, that's something else, but not, can't demand that they do that.
And also, I think we don't know enough, about different learning styles, and we get very anxious if they don't follow what we think their method should be. I just want to share one anecdote. When my son joined the Center for Learning years ago, at the age of 5, he knew only Kannada and no English at all. And so I was a bit concerned, how is this child going to manage in a school which is largely, English is spoken there. And then he came back home and said, after the first month, he said, I'm in a play in school, and drama, I'm doing a drama. I said, oh fine, what is your role? He said, I'm the elephant. So I said, yeah, so what are your lines? Do elephants speak? So I was put in my place, I just said my post. Then I announced to the whole world, my son is doing this play. there I was waiting for the elephant to come. The elephant came, but then it just came and it just went. And as it turned, I ran into this bottom. After all, I had watched it for so long. So then he went. That's it. And I was felt so ashamed. What kind of participation? Back of the elephant. And I was very insulted. But he had learned all the English he needed to learn in those 2 months because he knew everybody's dialogue. And they were using him as a prompt. If somebody spoke, he would say from inside, all their lines. So, I mean, this way of language learning, I never knew, and nobody, literature on language learning, of which I'm supposed to be the expert, has said anything about it. So, what I'm saying is there are really very, different, diverse ways in which learners learn and context teach, and we don't know enough.
Elephants have great memories.
Sure.
Jane, I won't respond in academic style because your whole talk has been about, perhaps challenging it. So I thought I will respond with a poem which, I remember this poem when you were talking about language as a living thing, and this is called Living Things. Our poems are like the warthogs in the zoo. It's hard to say why there should be such creatures. But once our life gets into them, as sometimes happens, our poems turn into living things. And there's no arguing with living things. They are the way they are.
Very good.
In terms of, it's such a dominant culture to speak in this mono language that we have within academics, the language of rationality, and largely English. Or if it is other languages, then it is the formal standard Kannada or Marathi or Bengali that we speak in. And then anytime we say think of reform or whatever, we are shushed because of the numbers, of the constraints of classroom, etc., etc. So the first question is, it is a move against the current of a monolingual domination. So how do you kind of see this way of respecting one's idiom, one's language, one's idiolect as it were, in a classroom? And how do we, because this idiolect has to at some stage, at some point, link up with the standard language that is spoken, otherwise it will go into isolation. So how do we make that connection is my question.
I think the first, I'm talking about young children.
Yes.
Is somebody called Sylvia Ashton Warner, which I'm sure, Sylvia Ashton Warner, and she actually got children to write down what they said and not what was in a book or what was standard language. And I don't quite know how she imagined it continued, but I think she saw it as a bridge. I don't think anyone is saying that the child has to stay in their home language. And that's, because we have to respect that. That would be a very romantic view, and anyway, parents don't want that. There have been studies done, for example, among the Soligas in Chamraj Nagar district. They didn't want their language actually in the school at all. But nevertheless, I think to sensitize teachers so that they respect a child's language. I don't know if any of you have seen the film that Indira and Padma, we showed it, whose language is it? but with Soliga school, the teacher was so insulting to the children, so insulting. And he knew he was being filmed. I think that was the most disturbing part, that he was so unconscious that this was anything wrong. He said to the children, you have no language. It's a bit of Kannada, it's a bit of this, you don't have a script, you don't have a language. And the children sit silently. It's a very short film, but it's a very powerful statement. So I think it's not either or, but I think it's making bridges, finding ways where, say in drama, where children can, for example, have dialogues which are totally within their, their home language. So it's not an either or. And it wouldn't be fair, and nobody wants to say you have to, we're going to protect, we're going to preserve your language. There has to be this bridge into standard language also. Did that answer your question?
I was just wondering about the how of it.
I mean, I think, for example, that also, for the youngest children, we don't have many books. They actually generate their own books in their own language. And I try to encourage the teachers to write down exactly what the children say. Teachers find that a difficult idea. They feel it's writing something wrong, and not different, but actually wrong. But there comes a time when children quite naturally also want to take the step to absorb, like your son actually, in a non-formal setting, in a non-threatening setting, when he could see the purpose of it, when he was in a way, in a space where he could do it at his own pace, he was ready for it. If somebody had drilled him into English, mocked at his Kannada, he would have been crushed.
Coffee and biscuits. So I'll see if it's outside. Please join us for some coffee. And a very big thank you to We'd like to see the rest of it. We'd like to see the rest of it. Don't watch it.
I only just brought it here. Just the idea of his mother's work. This again is just actually children.
Go back to the mother's work? Yeah.
You can use the down arrow, Jane, there.
Yes. So you can see a range of.
Wow.
Is the father's work as ready as this?
Actually, one of the children did a picture of his, the theme was father's work. So father's work. So he wasn't doing anything. So I said, what's the matter? He said he doesn't. There's one more. This is an interesting picture. One day the children came to school and they'd seen on their mobile phone a picture of a woman that was half a lizard and half human. And it said on the phone that because she had kicked the Quran, she had been turned into a lizard. And one of the children said, it's there with us. First when they said it, they said, no, it's not possible. And then they said, no, but it's on the, come, see, it's on the picture. It's on the mobile. So then we thought how to actually respond to this. And a little later, we asked the children to actually make images and make up news. So this was an image of a flood. They did various things in groups. So they said that the school had been flooded, that everything was lost, that the teacher, this is the teacher on the side, was nearly drowned. And it's not a brilliant photograph, but it was just the idea that images can be distorted, actually. That the image isn't true in itself. We didn't, afterwards we had a discussion on how do we know when news is true. But we didn't really refer to explicitly to that. Yes, good to see you. Yes.
Wonderful. Really.